As Astrid mentioned, my name is Louise O'Kelly. I'm the founding director of Block Universe, London's leading international performance art festival. In the background here, you'll see a number of scrolling images that are showing both previous year's artists as well as this year's artists. So, but behind me is 2017 happening. As Astrid mentioned, the fourth edition of the festival will take place from 26th of May to 3rd of June this year, so please save the date. It'll take place in a number of major institutions. As Astrid mentioned, we pair with different institutions every year. This year it'll be the Royal Academy of Arts, Somerset House, British Museum and Studio Voltaire, amongst a number of unique off-site locations throughout the city. I'm delighted to have some of the artists who will actually be performing in the festival this year with us tonight, Evan Ifikoy and Victoria Sim, who are producing a new commission. And of course, obviously, a number of other wonderful speakers who I'm so delighted to have in the conversation tonight. I'll run through a short introduction to each of them in a moment, but first, I thought it would be good to give a short overview to some of the concepts that we're looking at tonight, and also, as Astrid mentioned, my relationship with the Visual Cultures Department. I studied the Contemporary Art Theory course here, and how a lot of those ideas fed into actually the formation of the festival. I took Astrid's course, which was called Transcultural Memory, and Gavin Butt, who was here at the time, who ran the Reading the Performative course. I already intended to focus on performance before coming here, and for me the confluence of these two subjects was a really fertile ground for thinking around the ideas of performance and archiving performance. As Astrid's course, for me, was kind of a veritable compilation of different models for memory studies. So from ideas of intergenerational memory, the patterns of traumatic memory, and national processes of memorialization. And the course was proposing how we look at these applied to culture. So for me, I found this particularly exciting in relation to ideas of performance, which, most common discourse tends to focus around the ephemerality of the medium, its ability to disappear. And I was keen to look at an alternative to this, such as the body as archive, and explore the territory of embodied memory as an alternative to, I guess, the document. I might mention that there are some really fantastic thinkers who inform my thought processes around this, such as dance theorist Andrei Lepecki, who discusses this in relation to Japanese dancer Kazuo Ono's dragging of La Argentina, which was a flamenco dancer that he had witnessed many years prior, or embodied culture more broadly, such as Latin American scholar Diana Taylor's work in her book The Archive and the Repertoire, which looks specifically at Latin America at the point of colonization, and the strength of embodied practices as a means of transmitting cultural information over many generations. In terms of, I suppose, this relationship between embodied archives and the document, and their sort of interdependence on each other in many ways, I think that, my background as well of, prior having come to Goldsmiths was working with the estates of a number of performance artists from the 60s and 70s. And, I think that for me was kind of really interesting stepping off point in terms of looking at how they had approached archiving their work, or how their work still existed after their death in many different ways. And I was conscious that classic texts such as Peggy Phelan's discourse, which I'll quote here, performance's only life is in the present. Performance cannot be saved, recorded, documented, or otherwise participate in the circulation of representations or representations. Once it does so, it becomes something other than performance. So I felt that this tended to focus very much on the singular moment of performance, and was very much rooted in the type of performance being made in the 60s and 70s, where artists were quite actively proactively seeking to produce work that could not be modified or fall into the circulation of the art market. But I personally felt that this was quite a narrow viewpoint in terms of the type of performance being made today, and didn't necessarily do justice to types of performance that were designed to be repeated, such as dance, oral histories, song, music, that sort of thing. So I wanted to propose a third way, essentially, one that acknowledged the role of the body in the work, and to explore ideas around this idea of the body's archive, through cell memory, muscle memory, rehearsal, repetition, and propose the body as an archive that is accessed through performance. Incidentally, I might mention as well that for those of you who are curious, that this is where the title Block Universe also comes from. As Block Universe is a physics theory that explores an alternate theory of time where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. So for me, this was a really interesting idea to deal with when thinking about the idea of the body being the site for information as access to performance. So the idea that it's like ever present, essentially. And I suppose these concepts that I was dealing with, do I need to move a mouse here? These concepts, I suppose, were very influential also in the first edition of Block Universe in 2015, which was themed around the idea of legacies of performance, and was, I suppose, dealing with these ideas in particular about how we deal with, I suppose, the kind of ongoing relationship with performance and the longevity of, as a festival that was dedicated to supporting artists and promoting this type of work and creating support structures for it. It was the idea of how we continue to have that relationship with these works as time goes on. So the programming in the first year specifically focused on types of works that dealt with time, memory, or enacted this in some way, utilizing song, oral history, storytelling, and dance within this kind of context of the visual arts. So this is just like a brief introduction to the ideas that our speakers will be fleshing out today, and that hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left to actually explore in conversation at the end. And I think that, it's a really interesting lineup today in terms of both, as a festival, how we relate to the documentation of the works that we commission or present, but also for all of our speakers that have very unique perspectives and very different experiences in relation to archives and performance that I hope you'll get a sense of through their presentations, that thankfully we will actually have. First, I'll just give a little run through each of the speakers, and so you have a sense of who they are. Ellen van Schellenberg, who started her career as a dancer in the Netherlands before studying and dancing with Merce Cunningham in New York and Michael Clark in London. She obviously has an incredible depth of knowledge in regards her own personal relationships to archives, both physical and embodied, and she'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm also just going to briefly mention that we have a few copies of Michael Clark's publication by Violet Editions here, which Ellen put a lot of heart and soul into, I know. So if anyone is interested in buying those, they're for sale today at a reduced price of £3. Then we'll have the naturist, who were operating around the same time as Ellen in London and Michael Clark, and a host of other dancers and artists who were all very active in the rich 1980s nightlife and associated subcultures, connecting that space between punk and the new romantic scenes. And interestingly, actually on YouTube, and I believe in Goldsmith's library, which I watched when I was here, there is a copy of Charles Atlas's film Hail the New Puritan, which is a fictionalized documentary following Michael Clark and features people like Ellen, Lee Bowery, the neo-naturist, and a whole other cast of characters. And that's really a treat to watch, even if you just look it up on YouTube. So the neo-naturist, well, you might be familiar with their retrospective at Studio Voltaire, which featured a lot of archival documents, photography, and footage of their practice, which was primarily in the early 80s. And today we have Jennifer and Christine Binney here to speak about the work. So very excited about that. We also have Lois Keaton, who's the co-founder and director of the Live Art Development Agency, which is a really fantastic initiative that supports and promotes live art, and also has an incredible archive in their Bethnal Green offices, which I encourage all of you to go check out. Lois has a long relationship with live arts in the UK, coming from both working at the Arts Council in supporting performance art and interdisciplinary practices, and also was the Director of Live Arts at the ICA from 1992 to 97 in London. Following that, we'll have another collaborative artist presentation, which is Evan Ifekoy and Victoria Sin, who, as I mentioned, were commissioning a new work for this year's edition of Block Universe. Evan and Victoria have both their own individual practices, but have worked collaboratively since 2015, staging events and performance works that have been presented at the Royal College of Arts, Ottawa Italia Southeast, Steakhouse Live, and also in Stromboli for the Fiorucci Art Trust. Interestingly, they have actually been awarded a travel grant to go visit the Huntington Archives in Los Angeles to research Octavia Butler's archives in order to produce the new work for Block Universe. So I think as artists relatively earlier in their careers than perhaps the new naturists, it'll be interesting to hear their perspective as well on relationships to archives. And finally, we'll have Jane Pritchard, who is curator of dance at the V&A. Jane has extensive experience as a dance historian in writing about and dealing with archives, and also the thinking around what constitutes important material in the production of archives. And I think it'll be a really important voice in this conversation, representing an institutional position on these matters. She also, previously was archivist for the Round Burr Dance Company and English National Ballet, so I'm sure we'll have plenty to say about that. Before we wrap up, I'd just also like to take this opportunity to give serious thanks and gratitude to all of the artists who have come on this ride thus far with me, and of course my incredible team, who Astrid pointed out here this evening. And also specifically to Katharina Worf, who's our curator of public programs and who's put such an incredible amount of work into pulling together this lineup of speakers this evening. And I'm incredibly grateful to, as well as the rest of my team. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of Arts Council England, who thankfully believed in us from the start and supported us, and also to Guy Art Foundation, who from our second year have supported us, and I think as an organisation we're visionary enough to take a chance on us and really enabled us to grow significantly as a festival and continue to support us. I'd also like to thank Outset, who have been hosting me in a curatorial residency these past 2 months, and will also support a new commission this year, and once again to Astrid and Goldsmiths. So now I might pass over to Ellen and her presentation. Thank you.
We first show a couple of minutes of a performance of the work by Nina Bayer, the Complete Works, which is a work where you have to actually do nothing. You just come in and you remember chronologically all the works you've performed professionally. So the whole case is not to perform, really. So for me, it's always really hard to see myself do these things. I was beside doing the archive in Biel-Bienne in Switzerland, Nina Bayer asked me since 2011 to perform the complete works because she enjoyed the way I do it, by, I think, non-performing it, just allowing to let it happen. And what I saw when they asked me for some documentation, that during that time that I was performing the complete works, something else added to the archive, because I was very sad at some point and tired, and I can see all that in a strange way than, say, when I started in 2011 at the Tanks. What is interesting for me about this work is that it is like such a fine line of getting into space. People are watching. Most of the time people choose a front, which is strange because they can walk around, they can do whatever they want. You don't see it so clearly in this context. And it's something that is just happening, and people can just watch for a while and then move on. But strangely enough, they make a performance out of it, which is also an interesting fact. Nina, I don't think is meaning to do that. I think she prefers the forgetting. So when I just walk around and sort of think, this is not happening, what is it again? And I go and try and figure it out. And she's more into these little movements than the big sort of dance stuff. So in that way, my body is an archive of all the works that I have embodied and remember. And there's, of course, this whole thing about being now 64. At some point, I remember it all, but my body can't do it anymore. And that's also very interesting. So how is this going to happen further? Or if I do it again, I will do it probably very differently because I've changed in the time that I've been performing this piece. It needs a lot of courage. She really tells you, don't do anything, just come in like this and try to remember. And I think because of that, for me, it's a work of art, which is sort of created. It's a proposition. It's an art proposition. I think it's very beautiful, very poetic. My other sort of archival experiences is when I worked for Michael, and he has a lost archive, and that interests me also very much because in the same way I'm somehow the keeper of that archive because I remember it. Somewhere in 1994, the archive storage wasn't paid up, and it was all chucked out. And maybe only 2 codes, Jane has them, have been saved, and some material. And it's a very interesting thing for me to remember that archive and to find possible ways with digital innovation to recreate that. And also some of these dances I would like to do with students. And so you have a completely different proposition. It's a bit like Marcel Proust, à la recherche de temps perdu, and there it goes. But it exists somewhere in here, in Michael's body, and people are still alive, and some people have died. So then my other archive that I'm really interested in is Merce Cunningham's archive. Merce Cunningham knew that he was going to die. He had a very good archivist, David Fawn, and he collected everything, not in order to keep on his company and let these people do it again and again and again, faithfully, loyally, but to release the archive in New York, New York Public Library. Everybody has access to it, but also there's a little team that sort of now goes around the world and teaches these dances to people who live now in this life with this tempo. So these performances keep it alive by putting it in now and not by been faithfully recopying as how it was. And I think that's also a very good thing about archives, to use them that way.
And we're just going to show a sort of neo-naturist slideshow from our archive to give a little, maybe sort of potted history of the neo-naturists, but we're just going to talk about the slides as they come up. This is a picture of me, body painted by Wilma and photographed by Wilma in about 1980, projected onto Wilma's body in 2016 at Studio Voltaire with her camera in her hand ready to take another photograph of me. And I used this picture to go back to the beginning of the neo-naturist, because I haven't really got any digital pictures of the slides that's projected onto my body, so this is the nearest I could get to one of those pictures. And it was when I was Wilma's life model at St Martin's, and within about half a day we just got a bit bored of just Wilma painting me, so probably by the afternoon Wilma was actually painting my body rather than painting pictures of me, and we kind of moved on from there and became the neo-naturists. Oh, this is one of Wilma's paintings that she was doing at the time. And then there's another one in a minute to come. Oh, no, there isn't. Oh, that's me in the British Museum, body painted by Wilma, and doing a bit of flashing. And there's the same picture projected onto me at Studio Voltaire, which was quite a nice experience. Oh, now it's Jen's turn.
I started doing body painting from a slightly different route. I was in Portsmouth doing my fine art degree at Portsmouth Polytechnic, and that's where I met Grayson Perry, who was my boyfriend for 7 years. And part of it was because he was interested in cross-dressing, and we were experimenting with dressing up and going out in different outfits. And in a way I got a bit jealous, because for me to dress up as a boy wasn't very exciting, because I dressed like a boy most of the time anyway, in jeans and things. And so I was thinking, what can I do that's as much fun for me as he was having as dressing up as a woman? And the first body paint I ever did was I just painted tiger stripes on my body and went to a party like that. This paint that you see up here was slightly after that, but not very much. It's one of my first body paints. It's Andrew Logan's Alternative Miss World in 1981, where I was Miss Easy Rider, and Grayson did those tattoos on me. He did them in felt tip pen, and I came last. Next slide, please. And this is I think my very first piece of performance art, which was at Portsmouth when I was a student. One of our visiting lecturers was Bruce Lacey and Jill Bruce, and I really loved their performances that were kind of to do with earth magic a little bit, and they were quite hippie, and I liked them and I copied them a little bit, and that's what got me first interested in performance art. And this is a still actually from a film that I made with Grayson. Grayson and I made a lot of Super 8 and Standard 8 films together, and this one was very influenced again by Bruce Lacey's performances. And this is a pair of paintings I did a bit later after Portsmouth. After we finished at Portsmouth, we ended up living in London in a squat in Crowndale Road, and we used a room as a studio together, and I did a lot of big paintings at that time. And this is a painting of me and Grayson, but I've included it especially because at this time the neo-naturists were happening, We were doing a lot of cabarets and performances, and the whole thing of painting the body and the painted body coming into my paintings, it all connected, as you can see. This picture is the Fairy Fair. Bruce Lacey, again, Bruce Lacey came back into our lives. Bruce Lacey's Fairy Fair in about 1982, I think. This is Christine and Wilma at the front, me at the back, having my hair sprayed by Paula. We forgot to take the body paints, so we had to make body paint out of porridge and food colouring. Next slide, please. This is from the B2 Gallery in Wapping in 1982. We did a week-long residency there, where each day had a different theme. This was Black Rapport Day. We spent a lot of time hanging out on the beach at Wapping. Me, Christine and Wilma, and Prince the dog. We did a performance at the fountains outside Centrepoint, and we really just went up there in the nude and went in the water to see how long we could do that before we got told off. And we did it for quite a long time, and then we got very mildly told off. And that was that. Oh, this is one of Wilma's drawings, which is, I think, I thought that's what it was.
In fact, interestingly, with archives, that's one of it doesn't exist in reality, but my entire archive was burned, and we just found a few photos of the original plans for the cabaret. So the way that's become sort of part of the archive. But that was how we found them, just like that.
Quite a famous underwear design that we used to do in body paint. Okay. Burns Night or New Year's Eve, I can't remember. New Year's Eve, I don't know where, probably the fridge in Brixton, Christine. All these images, this is the last one in this set actually, all these images are between 1981 and 1986, which was when the three of us who are here tonight, did a lot of performances together in that time, and some of them were called performances in art galleries. Sometimes we called them cabarets, and they were in nightclubs. But we did the same thing, more or less. Okay.
There was London Fashion Week.
Oh yeah, yeah. This. Sorry, I didn't speak about this one, London Fashion Week. And it was. We found out later, I think, that we'd been asked to do it in order to sabotage some event, but we didn't know we were sabotaging it. We thought we were just doing a performance, and someone had paid us to go on stage in body paint. And
on the back it says flambé your brassiere.
I think it probably worked, I think, but some people were quite pissed off with us. It's your go now.
After a while, Wilma went to Mexico and then came back and didn't want to be a neonaturist anymore. And Jen, I think, was it before you had Magnus? No. Was it after? Yes. And then Jen went and lived in the countryside and had a baby. And in a way, I was left holding the baby. But instead of having a baby, my life got very menstrual. Although this is a giving birth performance, and we did quite a lot of strapping plastic bags to our tummies and pulling things out of them to give birth to them. I'm not quite sure what we were giving birth to at this one. Can you remember?
I can't remember, no.
We can have the next slide now. Oh, this is a menstrual synchrony performance at the Diorama, and it was based on the idea that women synchronise their periods from pheromones that come out from underneath their armpits. And I thought if we did a dance that's sort of like a country dance and rubbed armpits with each other, perhaps we could all synchronise our periods. So that was the idea. We're painted lovely in red because it's all very menstrual. And there were two men in the middle, and they were the maypole. And we did maypole dancing, and as we danced round them, we wrapped them up in ribbons, and they got all tied up. Next. And I'm also a potter. And this is a pot that I made at the same time as I was doing these performances. And it says, Bloody Mary, Holy Mary, Mother Mary, Bonnie Mary. And that is a menstrual image from an Aboriginal cave painting. Next. Oh, with tartan around the edge. This is from the, what was it called? Night of the Living Ultra Vixens nightclub. And we discovered that if you do body paint, actually I shouldn't really give away trade secrets, but I will. If you do body paint and then you put tights on top and then put porridge on top of that, the body paint stays intact underneath, so you can kind of be reborn on stage. So we came on, it was a St. Patrick's Day performance, so we came on as snakes. But we were reborn as menstrual women and leprechauns at the same time, once we took our porridge off. And this is us taking our porridge off. And we went to Latvia, where we took part in the Untamed Fashion Assembly, and some fashion students painted Latvian national costume onto us. And this is Jen with Latvian national costume. It's very intricate. And Jen has actually got the story of the universe around her waist, because they have these special belts which are woven with the story of the universe, and the fashion students knew the pattern off by heart. And this was only about a year after the Berlin Wall had come down, when Latvia was a very exciting place to go. And she's wearing a green wreath, which is, because we were over there at the summer solstice when they have their Ligua festivals. And those wreaths are symbolic as well, because when the Lithuanian radio station was overtaken that started the Berlin Wall coming down, lots of people were wearing the green wreaths in that revolutionary moment. Next. Oh. This is me doing some menstrual symbolism power to stop them building a motorway. I think it worked quite well. And I was worried I might get arrested, so I stuck little bits like they have, little black bits on my bosom, so that then I wasn't indecent. This is the Neo-Naturist Ladies Choir, which was a lovely manifestation of the Neo-Naturists. That was about 2001. And here is the Neo-Naturist archive displayed at Studio Voltaire. And I was meant to start talking about doing the archive at some point. So, yeah. It got to a certain point where there were just all these pictures and something had to be done with them, and it was a weight. And somebody said to me, you should get them in chronological order. And I actually started that probably in about 2006, which is the date on that book that's being passed around. And about 2/3 of it is done, and it's been a huge relief. And what happened was, as I was doing the archive, I started seeing the images from the archive floating onto pots, and that's what I started doing. And in pottery, the language of pottery is the same as you talk about the body of the pot, and the pot has a waist and a foot. And so I've sort of transferred the archive from my body onto the body of the pots, and it's been a liberation. It's been marvellous. It's really helped me move on and create new art and do different things by moving it in that way. And here's another pot, and I think next it's my sister's turn.
Next one. This is the image that was put onto the pot. Tartan theme, still going today, as you can see. Next. And something I did inspired by the same image, a painted screen. And Wilma's tartan painting as well. Oh, and that was in Studio Voltaire in 2016. We're still doing the old tartan-themed body paint. Another Studio Voltaire. I'm very, very tiny in that picture because I was too scared to go up the scaffolding. And another similar to the first one, Christine's body with one of Wilma's slides projected on it. Oh, this is one of our most recent performances. Wilma and I did a mud slags performance at Port Eliot Festival last year. And we did a talk a bit like this as part of that performance, but the performance was much more part of the talk at that event. It was pouring with rain, which ruined it. That's my horse, which I painted, body painted him. And me painted just by chance like that, and I matched in almost exactly with a painting I did about 30 years ago. That was at Studio Voltaire as well. That's a very recent painting. I did a performance about a month ago, Valentine's performance, and nobody took any photos, and I completely forgot to document it. So I did a painting of it instead. And that's the final slide, just conjuring up the neo-naturist atmosphere. Thank you.
Hello, London. Testing. I'm Lois from the Live Art Development Agency. Huge thanks to Louise, to Astrid, everybody involved in Block Universe for inviting me to be part of this. It's great to be speaking with all these other illustrious speakers. And thanks to my colleague Alex, who's put together this PowerPoint that is sort of representative of the work we do at the Live Art Development Agency, not necessarily illustrating what I'm going to say. So I'm just going to speak very quickly and ramble through some stuff, a little bit about the Live Art Development Agency, a little bit about some archival stuff that we've done, a few thoughts on questions about archives and histories, and then look forward to talking about some of the things that come up in the panel discussion. So Live Art Development Agency, we've been going since 1999. We talk about ourselves these days less as a development agency, because we believe that live art has very successfully developed since 1999. So we talk about what we do more as a sort of centre for live art, a knowledge and research centre, production centre for programmes and publications, and an online centre for research dissemination. And we work to try and support everybody who sort of makes, watches, teaches, studies, researches, curates, produces, archives, writes about live art. And we do that through a range of different sort of opportunities, projects, resources, and publications. And a lot of the work we do is trying to create the conditions in which innovation, diversity, and risk can flourish. So very much trying to invest in the future of live art, invest the future of artists, the future context, the future areas of research, future publications, stuff like that. But as much as we're interested in futures, we're interested in pasts, and trying to, the way that sort of pasts have shaped and influenced nows. And we're interested in questions about what and who is documented, recorded and archived, in how it's done, what forms archives can take, what forms documents can take. And they're not just images of other people as suggested before, they're words, they're bodies, they're traces. We're interested in how histories and archived are framed, how histories and archived are accessed, and by who. Who is all this sort of happening for? And so I'm just going to talk about a few of the projects that we've done, which have been trying to sort of attend to those kind of issues. So as Louise said, we have a library at Lardo. We never talk about it as an archive, talk about it as a sort of collection. But we have an event the other month about sort of performance archives from Southeast Asia, and various people there insisted that what we had was an archive, so I sort of thought we had a great collection, and now we've got a kind of not very good archive, I realise. But we have this study room archive, and we it's a sort of ongoing process for us to just make sure that we are stocking all of the kind of materials we should be stocking for the people who are using the study room, which is sort of students, artists, researchers, teachers, the sort of the works. And we do lots of things with the study room as well to sort of try and open up the archives, open up those histories, open up those resources in different ways. So we commission artists to write study room guides around particular themes, to sort of point study room users to the materials they can access around those themes, but also to point towards us of materials that we don't have that attend to those themes. So there's sort of research tools for us, and there are also research tools for the people who use our archive, who use our materials. We also have a lot of stuff online as well. We have a thing called Live Online, where we track sort of short films and documentation of projects that we've done and other sort of materials that we hold. And other sort of specifically archival projects, which are sort of web-based archival projects. We have a project, sort of ongoing project at the moment called Performance Magazine Online. We work with Rob Lafreniere, the editor of Performance Magazine, which for those of you who don't know, was a really hugely influential magazine that sort of set the scene for the kind of practices we're looking at today that ran between 79 and 92, Alex. And we've worked with Rob on a sort of an online archive of those, of all of the magazines, but it's also sort of commissioned some contemporary content to speak to those archives, to keep those histories alive, which I'll come back to in a minute. We also worked on a project called Glimpses of Before. It's a collaboration with Dominic Johnson and Nick Rideout from Queen Mary University and an artist called Helena Goldwater, which is particularly looking at 1970s performance art and looking at sort of the influences and legacies. And again, sort of trying to make sure that those histories weren't lost. A kind of a really important, another sort of strand of our work is we do a lot of publishing. We've published about sort of 80 or so books and DVDs for about the last 10 or so years. A lot of those are just in direct collaboration with artists. Artists want to get their work out there, and so we work with them to publish their books and get them out there in the world. But also we're interested in sort of publications which are kind of looking at sort of histories that might be lost, or sort of records, publications about artists who haven't been sort of covered in other ways. So we have a series called Intellect Live, which is sort of substantial, beautifully designed books for sort of significant publications on sort of key artists like Ron Athey, artist called Adrian Howes, who died a couple of years ago, Raymond Hogue, and we've just published a book on Kira O'Reilly, his first publication about Kira O'Reilly. A really important project for us is a project we've been running since 2006 called Restock, Rethink, Reflect. And that is a project that's sort of mapping and marking underrepresented, lost, marginalised histories, practices, artists and moments. So the first iteration of that was on race, the second iteration on disability, the third on feminism. We're in the current iteration of that project, which is on class and cultural privilege. And again, it's sort of just trying to make sure that because of the ephemeral nature of performance art, as Louise said, a lot of that work is not documented, and so that's particularly the case for sort of culturally marginalised artists, so there's a sort of double loss. So we've been doing a lot of work to try and make sure that those histories aren't lost, that those histories are there and available. We ran a project a few years ago called Legacy. It was a collaboration with Tate Research and the Arts Council, and it was sort of quite substantial awards to two artists to look at what legacies meant to them and what their legacies might be, particularly sort of using Tate's archives as sort of source research material for that, and the sort of, I think the message that came out from that was sort of do the opposite of Tate archives. Tate archives sort of tend to sort of one, remove the performance art element from most sort of artist work that goes into Tate archives, but also they become sort of what people would call kind of dead records rather than not active archives. And again, I'll come back to legacy in a sec. But the work with archives that we're doing with archives is not just about sort of rewriting histories and sort of recognising and acknowledging and influencing the influence of then on now. It's also about, particularly in the context of this discussion about living archives, it's also about looking at archives as themselves as sort of materials and resources to make or to imagine something else, and creating sort of new forms of archives as active, generative and creative forces. So I just want to sort of talk very briefly about one particular artist that we've, that artist in fact, that we've sort of worked with a lot over many years, Anne Bean. And Anne's a really interesting artist because the first time I ever worked with Anne, way back in the day when I was at the ICA, Anne was one of those amazing performance artists who absolutely sort of resisted documentation. And as everybody knows, I mean, one of the reasons why performance has such a sort of fragmented history is so many artists resisted documentation. If you had to be there. If you weren't there, then you weren't there. And Anne was absolutely sort of resistant to documentation. But having said that, she also has the most extraordinary archive and thinks about archives in ways that just extraordinarily sort of influential ways. So Anne was one of the artists who received a legacy award, and rather than looking at her own legacy, she wanted to look at the legacy of her collaborator Paul Burwell, who died just a few years before that. And so she did a project called Taps, and she invited about 80 different artists to all sort of make short films, different kind of performances, different pieces of writing on the sort of the influence of Paul Burwell on their practice, but also the influence of Paul Burwell across a whole bunch of disciplines. She did beautiful things like revisited these sort of films of Paul from the 70s talking about work and put herself into the films, having kind of conversations with Paul. So she'd sort of, she'd ask Paul a particular, a question from now that Paul would be answering from the 1970s, the most extraordinary project. Anne was also one of the artists we worked with on the Performance Magazine online project. She did a performance up in Hull as part of a sort of festival with Whole Time-based arts last year, Rerouted, which was an archival project looking back at whole time-based arts work. And Anne did this extraordinary performance where she performed with to Performance Magazine, and that was documented and turned into a film, which is on the Performance Magazine online site, along with other commissioned works, commissioned writings about the influence and legacy of Performance Magazine. Anne was also a sort of key partner on a project we did last year called Afterlives. It was a project looking at the sort of the legacy and influence of 4 amazing artists who died recently: Rosamund Kelsey, Lol Coxhill, Roger Ely, and Ian Hinchcliffe. And Anne was one of the performers at that, particularly looking at the legacy of Rosamund Kelsey's work. She's doing a whole body of work around dialogues with sort of with artists, collaborators who died in recent years. And so she did this collaboration with sort of the influence, the memory of Rosamund Kelsey. Anne said about that, she said it was a strange, uplifting evening. Maybe this is what's needed. Something like the Mexican Day of the Dead, not gloomy, but incredibly life-enhancing, as people recount the presence of their beloved friends and colleagues and experience their lives again, telling their stories, sharing their music. And the final thing I just want to say about Anne is we're working with Anne on a title in the Intellect Live series called Self, Etc., which is a sort of a publication that she's working on with Rob Lefrene, which is including visual documentation of her work and critical essays by a whole bunch of different sort of commentators and people that she's collaborated with over the years. So I'm going to finish there, but I just want one final thing to say, that I do think the sort of histories of performance art, and they are histories, it's not a singular history. I think everybody in this room would have a very would tell a very different history of the kinds of things we're talking about. But I think these kind of histories, they're as much recall as record, and they're oral histories as much as art histories, and both of those things are completely unreliable. Thank you very much.
Because performance means the act of taking control of history by becoming its subject through repetition. There is also another issue here about the mode of storytelling that has to do with history. You're never starting from scratch. The questions of how to inherit are always here. I'm consumed by the question of how to live with our inheritances, how to not disown them. We have many inheritances, so we need that kind of humility. The humility of never starting from scratch. The humility of never starting from scratch, and from never starting clean, and as well inheriting obligations we did not and cannot choose, but which we must respond to.
No to the authentic body. No to illusion. No to a fixed form. No to the pastness of the past. No to the visual erasure of the means of production. Utopian yearning exists at the edge of the frames. No to linearity. No to straight time. Yes to temporal drag.
Because subjectivity is lived in public and shaped by history. Because we are trapped in history. Because performance means the act of taking control of history by becoming its subject through repetition. Because performance allows for lines of desire. Because performance doesn't mean acting. No to hierarchies between a good and a bad scene.
No to psychological motivations. No to rehearsals.
Yes
to copies, crossings, imitations, and the enactment of previously shaped poses. Back on the dance floor, she follows her friend as he marks out a central area by doing a little turn and looking at her. Here?
Is it all over me?
Yes, perfect. She slides her jacket off and places her drink on the side. She dances with her shoulders and her hair, and has picked up his habit of spinning. Dancing for her is like a conversation. He takes some steps and punctuates them with a spin. She answers him with a sidestep into a turn finished with a hair flick. They trail off and away from each other, dancing in tangents, stepping, spinning, hands up, out. When there's enough space, walking, runway. Others join them, stay or wander away again.
Making a spectacle of oneself is a political act. Because performance means the act of taking control of history by becoming its subject through repetition.
Responsibility is that cultivation through which we render each other capable, that cultivation of the capacity to respond. Responsibility is not something you have towards some kind of demand made on you by the world, or by an ethical system, or by a political commitment.
Responsibility is not just something you respond to as if it's already there. Rather, it's the cultivation of the capacity of response in the context of living and dying in worlds for which one is for, with others. So I think of responsibility as irreducibly collective and to be made in some really deep ways that which is not yet but may yet be. It's a kind of luring, desiring, making with.
Because performance means the act of taking control of history by becoming its subject through repetition.
I also really love the word feelers for the tentacles because none of your other organs say what they do. We don't have seers or smellers.
Feelers are actually an action name. Think of Medusa. The snakes, of course, freeze the man who looks directly at them. But they are also feelers. The snakes are sensory apparatuses. Rustin Hogness pointed this out to me. They swirl.
And also that really wonderful word that I learned from Eva, tentacularity. The way that figures, stories, and multisensory apparatuses reach out to their audience and enroll them.
And engulf them and sometimes sting them. Because a lot of these tentacles have little poison sacs and darts on them. They are apparatuses of predation as well. They are not innocent figures. These are figures of living and dying, of risk and entanglement. These are figures for inhabiting attentively with responsibility.
There is always the question of who is enrolled by figures, who is enticed, and who is scared.
As part of Block Universe Festival, we will present Scripting Speculative Bodies, where the tentacles reign supreme.
So it's a science fiction script that imagines a potential future of embodiment within a new socio-political system. Will harness the potential offered by the space of Octavia E. Butler's unfinished third book in the parable series, Parable of the Trickster, where humanity has managed to relocate to a new planet with a chance of a fresh start.
Like the Earth Seed of Butler's Parable series, the script will be populated by a series of short poems which unfolds the governing principle that drives the text.
Sympathy as condescension, empathy as kinship, kindness eases change.
Drawing loosely on the form of a narrative script as a vehicle to hold together many elements and questions, such as in Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, where the form of a story is not to dictate a moral or to present a didactic path, but rather to consider a series of propositions, ideas, and contexts.
And as part of our research, as Louise said, we'll be taking a trip to Los Angeles to work at the Huntington Archives, which holds the papers of Octavia Butler and includes extensive drafts, notes, and the research materials for more than a dozen novels and numerous short stories, essays, as well as correspondence, ephemera, and assorted books. Butler's various representations of embodiment, power dynamics, and relationships with the other within an imagined future has and continues to be central to our collaborative practice.
To survive, let the past teach you. Past customs, struggles, leaders and thinkers. Let these help you. Let them inspire you, warn you, give you strength. But beware, God is change, past is past. What was cannot come again. To survive, know the past, let it touch you, then let the past go.
So how do pronouns not only shape communication, but also our thinking? Gendered pronouns enforce limiting ways of thinking about personhood. Reconfiguring how pronouns are used changes how we relate to human and non-human others. And so the idea of hyperempathy is central to the first two parable books. So we're thinking about how hyperempathy manifests not just in relation to violence and pain, but also in relation to ecological questions. How do we reimagine our relationship to non-humans, how we speak for them? Like one of Butler's other books, Bloodchild, we'll consider what decentering humans in our discourse might look like.
A protagonist as an environment rather than embodied through a human. Humans are no longer on top of the food chain on a planet that is 95% water. The ecosystem of a new planet has resulted in a dominant species that is closer to the octopus. The corporeality of the octopus, whose brain is split between its head and limbs, ideas of vision and blindness. How might we see in new ways beyond vision?
Intelligence is ongoing, individual adaptability. Adaptations an intelligent species may make in a single generation, other species may make over many generations of selective breeding and selective dying. Yet intelligence is demanding. If it is misdirected by accident or by intent, it can foster its own orgies of breeding and dying.
A new power structure has emerged where the hierarchies within sexual play, doms, subs, tops, and bottoms, are a central governing principle. We reimagine sex and consider what it means to re-weaponize desire. Tentacular, sexual alien squid overlords.
All struggles are essentially power struggles. Who will rule, who will lead, who will define, refine, confine, design, who will dominate. All struggles are essentially power struggles, and most are no more intellectual than two rams knocking their heads together. Because performance means the act of taking control of history by becoming its subject through repetition.
Right, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm the dry, dead bit at the end, in some senses. So very much more the formal sort of situation that happens in a national institution. Having said that, I don't see our collections in the Victoria and Albert Museum as totally dry and dead. I think they are used a great deal for inspiration. And within the sort of areas of the V&A, I think we are able to bring quite a lot to life. We do have a lot of rules and regulations guiding what we're allowed to do, which makes life a little bit more challenging at times. I think I should also say that we are not actually collecting live art at the V&A. That's much more directed to the collections at Bristol. However, we are concerned, I would say, as much as we can be with any form of performance, and in terms of contextualising that performance. And we have a wonderful relationship with a lot of performers. So I'm focusing on dance, and I'm sure this all looks terribly, terribly formal compared with what we've been seeing before. But just in amongst the images that we have on the screen here, I think in the corner here, this is when Lee Anderson, with 50 dancers, took over the Raphael Court and presented a living exhibition. And for me, this was a real big achievement for us. Something that really hadn't happened in this way at the V&A before. But essentially she had come saying, I'd love to put on an exhibition, lots of people come and say this to us, but I don't want garments on mannequins, I want them to live. I want to look at what I've done in the past so it becomes a retrospective. And so that was, I think, actually an exciting moment, the 3 days that we were able to do that. Other than that, I think the important things here are sort of reusing something like a toy theatre being reworked into a stage production. And I think with sort of actually drawings and things like that, sketches, they are actually often a lot more living than sort of photographic records. I just put this in because I think it's always worth knowing where we come from. We were founded essentially nearly 100 years ago in terms of the theatre performance area and came about as a result of an exhibition. Somebody called Mrs. Enthoven had been desperately concerned that no one in Britain was concerned about live performance of any sort, so theatre was not something that was being documented and collected. An exhibition was mounted at the V&A in 1922, and I think what's quite interesting there is almost that the director of the V&A at that point is suddenly sort of saying, right, actually it does fit into the V&A's brief. So theatre touches architecture, painting, design and decoration in many forms. What I think is fun, he's looking at those elements that have almost moved away from the living theatre, the elements that survive. That does become the basis that we worked from, but I think we have, as I say, moved on. Initially, Mrs. Enthoven funded the entire collecting of theatrical material. Her staff were provided with uniforms, something that doesn't happen anymore. Everything was card catalogued, and those elements in themselves become absolutely fascinating. How do you deal, a pioneer trying to deal with what you do with this material? How can we make it available to the public? And I think that's the key. It's not just keeping it, it's making it available, making it accessible that really matters. So we have our core collections where material has been collected over nearly 100 years, programs, designs, photographs, autograph letters, prints and drawings, all sorts of materials coming through there. And of course costumes and designs. We cover everything from the 17th century ballet decor to really what is happening on stage today. Costume is a very large part of what we're dealing with, but we only started collecting costumes seriously in 1974. So it's really very late on. So I've just put on the screen ballet Russe material. One of the things that's sort of amazing about this, you look at these elderly costumes, and it's the closest you're going to get often to the performance. The DNA of the artist is still in some of those costumes. We love the costumes that have been worn, that show that they have been worn. So we don't want things that are too pristine, really. We want living material. This is where we're very different to other parts of the V&A. We would much rather have something that's just come off sort of the line. We want things that have been worked. And so with something like the Rite of Spring, sort of the fact that some of them are disintegrating, some of them are, just the sweat of the dancers coming through have caused problems, actually makes them much more interesting. And also some of the written documents are hugely fascinating. I love this sort of diary that Lana Bradley kept, called his Ballet Bulletin, but really it was a blog before blogs, because he would write up every single performance he saw, and he saw just about everything that was happening in London in terms of dance and also concerts. And he sent it round to his friends, so it went from one to the other. The amazing thing is that the post office must have been so efficient in those days, because they've actually survived. So he actually notes who he's sending them to, when they got them and all the rest of it. But what I love about them is the fact that he, of course, changes his mind. He reacts differently on different days. He reacts differently to different casts. Now, you might say, oh, well, the critics do. They do to a certain extent, but they don't go as often. They don't change their mind as often. And they aren't often as honest. Very, very forthright about what he thinks about people. And I've just included here some of our sort of quirky objects really from the 19th, very early 20th century. Okay, so thinking about sort of fairy, the puddle couch there is actually really more of a can-can than anything else, but also things that inspire people, so the flap shoes, for example. So originally really an idea invented by Little Titch, sort of how you could sort of use this long base and then move in a different way as a result of it. But also the whole thing was sort of thinking about sort of lighting effects, coming in with skirt dancing with Loie Fuller, and then with Letty Lind, that wonderful series of her disappearing. So the disappearing act is always going to be fascinating. Photographs are an important area for us in terms of documentation. We go back for well over 100 years in our photographs. We have some of the earliest on-stage performance photographs in existence. Obviously the earliest photographs are just posed. But just sort of thinking how things change, how we have this ability to record what was happening. Initially with photographs you'll find that they are very much recording what the performer looks like, what they're wearing, and then you move on to actually get some sort of sense of performance coming in. We have collections relating to companies, we have collections relating to individual performers, we have designers' collections, and it goes sort of on, so that's only just sort of a taster in terms of some of the things we have. Amongst our most recent acquisitions, there are a whole series of costumes made for Nijinsky and her company in 1925, virtually all of them designed by Alexandra Exter. So really very exciting, but the costume on this side is actually a costume designed by Leon Bax. So originally it was a costume for her brother, Václav Nijinsky. It was much brighter, there was much more green originally, because this costume was actually reworked in 1919 really into constructivist style. And I think this is where, to me, theatre becomes really interesting. It begins as one thing, it goes on and develops as others. So we're always on the lookout for these sort of things that sort of, in a way, sort of give you a great deal more of a story. We are people who look at objects and say, what is the story behind this? We will, where possible, if somebody is giving us something or we're acquiring something, we will try now and talk to those people, interview them, so it's not just a costume. It's something that really has a life of its own, and I think that area is terribly important. The other costumes on the far side, which actually are on display at the moment in the jazz exhibition at 2 Temple Place, are part of a whole series that were really the most sort of avant-garde dance event in Britain in 1925. What I love is it never came to London. It toured seaside towns and spas, and I guess it wasn't the greatest success, but then we all know if you're doing something challenging, reaching out to new audiences, something completely unexpected, complete with wonderful face painting, because we're wearing liquid masks at the time, becomes absolutely fascinating. So just a quick taster, but I'm just ending on this image, because I think it's a very easy way to see how objects in our collection carry on and live. So when Matthew Vaughan was starting out in Swan Lake, he was looking at Nijinsky. So from the beginning of the century to the end of the 20th century, you can see that influence coming straight through. Thank you very much.
As an initial starting point, I felt, because I think there's so much to touch upon when you're looking at the connections between archives that are much more reliant on, say, photography or documentation, those paper archives, versus the idea of embodied archives and, you know, the kind of whole breadth of what that entails, whether it's reperformance or adaptation or, you know, a mutation or what other kind of concepts there might be related to that. But I thought maybe as a starting point, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what any of you thought a successful archive might look like. I don't know if any of you have, I mean, Jane probably has very specific views on this, but I don't know if anyone else does.
I'll start just because I work a lot with archives. I kind of always have done as part of my work. And as somebody who kind of goes and visits and takes them in, for me, it's one where you feel comfortable and feel at home, which is actually really rare in an archive. There's a lot of, and don't get me wrong, I understand there's a lot of kind of, you know, kind of things around preservation and maintenance, but actually, Labena Himid has an archive up in Preston called the Making Histories Visible archive, which I've been working with since about 2013. And you go there and you feel at home. It's kind of hard to explain in a way, but there's something about, I guess, the way everything's laid out, the way that things are catalogued, and just the way that the space is that kind of allows you to feel at home and close with the material, which for me is an indication of a successful archive.
I really love that, what you're saying there about it being a friendly place, a welcoming place, a place that you can easily use. I always think this is terribly important because with me, I've always said the archive only exists for the user. It's valuable in terms of preserving memory and artifacts, but there's no point in just hiding them away. So access is terribly important. And I would say at the moment at the V&A, we know we're going to have to move our stores, which means we'll also be moving our research rooms to East London. And so one of the things we're really focusing at the moment is how can we make this much more user-friendly for people. So anyone who has ideas about what they want from archives, certainly now is the time to speak up and let us know, because we do want to make it so that at the moment we can only take a limited number of people on a day. We always ask people to let us know what they want in advance, largely because we don't want people sitting around. There's nothing worse when you go to an archive. You haven't ordered in advance. I don't mean ordered, we just say let people know what you want so that it will be ready, because archives can be vast. I always wish that we had... I should have brought an image for you to see the extent of our archives, because I always wish people could actually see how much there is there. And again, that's the sort of thing I hope that we are looking at, so there will be sort of at least visual access so people have an idea of what is there, what the volume is, and the challenges we face running around finding everything for people.
In that regard as well, just something that you said about it feeling like home somehow when you go to the archive, that you're comfortable there. I was conscious that, in the presentation as well, and particularly in your presentation, when you're referring to imagery and you're kind of bouncing off each other about like, oh, when was this, where was that? I'm really kind of interested in how, I guess, the idea of communities around archives, or, this idea of... I suppose, when you mentioned home, it made me think of this when you have a connection to something, I guess. And I'm curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about this and how that's kind of fed into the creation of your archive and what you've been trying to deal with, and how having kind of that community of people might help to create something more comprehensive.
You've given me an idea of something to say. One of the things I forgot to say when I was talking is that various people we knew started getting famous, like Boy George and Lee Bowery and Grayson Perry, and they all started writing books. And it was just really annoying, because as soon as the neo-naturists were mentioned, it was just this horrible version of us that I didn't really want to think, oh, that's who people think the neo-naturists are. So that's one of the things that made me start to get the archive together and collect, try and get our version of events. Because, okay, the sort of archive of people outside of you is one, but then if that takes over what you feel like you were doing, you feel like you've got to do your version as well.
I completely agree with that. I think it also sort of relates a little bit to what a successful archive sort of could be. And I think one of the things absolutely is that it's accessible now, but it's also sort of future-proofed in certain kinds of ways as well. So we're thinking about sort of histories and how histories are going to be sort of read in the future as well as talking to now. But to be sort of transparent around questions of sort of subjectivity and sort of partiality, because all archives are inevitably going to be sort of partial, rather than sort of comprehensive and completist. But if they position themselves as comprehensive and completist, then inevitably there's sort of questions of sort of cultural values about who and what are not included in those archives. So I think that sort of sense of what is in the archive, but also a recognition, acknowledgement of what's not in the archive, is also a really important thing for a successful archive.
So I'm curious then as well about this this idea of what's missing from the archive. So I suppose what remains undocumented, and I'm sure, I think, a lot of work that exists today, you touched upon it in your presentation as well, about, not every artist actively documents their work, or some don't want to, some choose not to. And whether that's a conscious decision or not, I think that's a really interesting point to talk about. Because I think often when we're looking at archives of performance or this sort of thing, often it's the ephemera around it, or like you said, it can be eyewitness accounts. And I mean, something that kind of, I was speaking with Victoria briefly and just walking in here, and it made me think about this idea of like when you take authorship and ownership of archives or the presentation of your work. You were speaking about a performance that you'd done that had been documented, and you were creating the footage for this. And I think there's, really interesting examples of that in the past. For example, you know, Hannah Wilkie, I remember she did a performance, I think it was The Kitchen in the 70s, called Soup and Tart, where, you know, she did a performance, it was filmed, and then she actually created her own set of photographs, you know, depicting essentially how she wanted the performance to be read and what those kind of gestures and movements meant to her, rather than maybe the experience of having a camera in a corner filming the whole scene. Would you mind talking a little bit about that idea?
So I think on this idea of like being an artist and being an artist who works in performance and documenting my work, or making sure that the work that happens, which is ephemeral and only lasts for an afternoon or an evening, is remembered in a way that the artist wants. I'm going to talk a little bit about my project Dream Babes, which was it's a project that looks at how artists use speculative fiction within performance, and it included a 3-day program of performance at Auto Italia Southeast. And after the 3-day program, we released a zine where I had all of the artists who did performances, including myself and Evan, create like a text or some images that would represent the moment that had passed, basically. And this zine is now, it's at the Live Art Development Agency in the archive, and it's at the Stuart Hall Library. It's also in the British Library. But this is like something that I think, especially if you're an artist who applies for Arts Council funding, you're continuously asked to plan like how you're going to document and archive and have like a legacy for the work that they're paying for. But you know, also it's important as an artist to be self kind of historicizing, to make sure that there's a record of it. So definitely for this performance that I was talking to you about when we were walking in, the performance is thinking a lot towards like how different elements of it can be represented afterwards. So the main event of it is a performance, but it's a performance which encompasses 9 narratives, which are spoken, vocal kind of narratives. It's about kind of the act of storytelling. And within it, there's a soundtrack. So within the performance, this whole soundtrack plays, and the soundtrack will be the same if you access it afterwards. So that kind of element of the performance can live on after the performance. As well, there's going to be a publication, which is kind of like a script of the whole thing, which you can kind of... which will be available afterwards. But these are different ways that I'm thinking, like, you know, people will not be able to be in the performance after the event, but they'll be able to, like, engage with the ideas and the sounds of what it was like to be there. As part of Evan and I's work that we've been commissioned by Block Universe to present, we're creating a script, basically, a kind of science fiction script for the future of kind of what bodies and sexuality will look like. And this will be a document that we create a performative reading with, and that could mean and look like many things. But this will also be a document that you'll be able to access afterwards.
I just wanted to just add something a little bit about that, because I think actually our collaboration is probably the most documented my performances ever are. Like my individual performances, I'm kind of also anti-documentation, but actually something I've been in. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of Ian White, who is a sort of artist and who works a lot in performance, and he's having a show soon. Like a post-Hummer show, and I've been invited actually to do a performance based on one of his scripts, and I'm actually kind of interested in that as an idea, because actually something I also don't do is perform in other people's work. But I was actually really excited by this invitation, the invitation to take an artist's script and reinterpret it and give it a new life. So yeah, this idea of actually kind of working from somebody's material to then bring something new into the world is exciting to me, but the idea of kind of just reproducing something that already happened doesn't really interest me that much.
Yeah, Marina Abramovich did that with sort of 7 easy pieces, because she was constantly being approached by younger artists about doing her work, and she was like, it's my work, why would somebody else want to do it? And then she said, actually maybe there is something quite
interesting in this, and so she did 7 Easy Pieces, which was her reenacting other works, and particularly was interesting her reenacting or revisiting works by male artists as well, and what happens when you sort of put it in another kind of body. But one of the projects that was one of my sort of favourite archival projects was a project that Hayley Newman did in the 90s called Connotations, and Hayley Newman was sort of felt and was kind of keenly aware that there were certain types of work that was being sort of privileged in histories, and that was the work that was documented. And she particularly looked at interior scroll, Carolee Schneemann's, and sort of, well, it's probably the most famous performance image in the world, and more people have seen that image than ever saw the performance. This piece, Interior Scroll, which I'm sure everybody in the room knows it. But this kind of sense that it's being held up as one of the greatest pieces in performance history. But is it that, or is it just everybody knows it because there's this image? So she was really interested in kind of the performances that are remembered and that therefore are sort of privileged are the ones that have the strongest documentation. So she did this project called Connotations, where she devised and performed fictitious performances. So she would sort of do these performances, she would document the performances. So of course they weren't fictitious performances, they were real performances, but the texts that were being written about them were fictitious, and she was interested in that, how you can sort of create fictions around kind of performance histories, this sort of idea of sort of unreliability of performance histories. But it's a really fantastic project, and I do encourage everybody to check it out, because of course, as I say, by making these fictitious performances, she actually had to make real performances.
We weren't photography, we just forgot to take the camera and got too carried away.
Love it. But yeah, that's quite an interesting point then, when you're talking about people experiencing the work today, or for audiences here to understand what you did. And I think a lot of what you guys are talking about just there is really interesting in terms of, I suppose, this idea of re-performance as well, or that I suppose the kind of interdependency of performance of the body on the document, whether that is the written word or a video or a photograph. But I think that kind of touches on a little bit. I mentioned Diana Taylor earlier because of her work looking at Latin American histories at the point of colonization, and something that she talked a lot about in this book is this idea of the strength of body-to-body transmission. So that I suppose over many generations, cultural information such as like ritual, oral history, song, weaving a particular way or making a certain dish is often passed on directly between people without kind of needing a piece of paper or something in between that. But I think, I suppose in things like Marina Abramovich's work, or I think Tanya Bruguera did a similar thing with Ana Mendieta of like re-performing her works. They were often based on documentation of some sort. So rather than that Marina happened to have attended all of those performances, they were based on either imagery or, video or just descriptions. So I'm kind of curious in exploring, I suppose, the interdependency of those, but also this idea of re-performance. And I'm curious, I mean, what might you feel, or you guys, or like I know Ellen as well is obviously kind of embodied a lot of works herself. How you might see those existing in the future, and what your thoughts are about re-performing. There's an artist, Julie Tolentino as well, who offers her body as an archive and has done so for the work of Ron Athey, who Lois will know well. And I'm curious about what you feel about that direct relationship between re-performance or like you said, perhaps an adaptation of past performances. Maybe if you can speak to that.
Well, it was your idea really more, but we were planning to do a re-performance and to get young people to
Can I just say here that I felt that would be completely wrong, because our performance was that it was us and our bodies, however they were, and that's what people. And if we had younger
But maybe we will in the future, I don't know. But we never agree on anything. That's the beauty of working in a collaboration. But in a way, we did do the re-performance, but at the ages we are now, which made it very interesting. I think the thing we did at the ICA as part of Studio Voltaire was a sort of re-performance. You know.
Yeah, it's definitely in the spirit of what we used to do. Recreate it on the same line.
But in the way that Ellen was talking about, it was much more of a strain. It used to be quite easy to just sling a bit of body paint on and do something. And it took us months. And just it just turned into this huge thing. Anyway, we did it. And I'm not that keen on redoing them at the moment, but I'm still determined that I am going to be a body painted octogenarian. I'm really looking forward. Actually, when I get dementia, will someone just wheel me out and stick some body paint on me? And I'm really looking forward to doing performances with my nappy on and body paint and all that. So it won't be a re-performance, it'll be a different one. But, you know, it's just doing the same thing at different ages is really interesting. So you are, you know, you're the same person, but you're a different person.
Bobby Baker did a really famous piece in the 80s called Drawing on Her Mother's Experience, about their experience of when she had her first two children. And she revisited that work a couple of years ago, drawing on her grandmother's experience.
I at one point was asked a couple of years ago to restage just one dance from I'm Curious Orange, and with students from Laban, and we were invited by the art school. And it was actually really interesting because they got a band together from people they knew playing the fall. Mark Smith is dead now, you know, sort of, it's very interesting. And then what I saw with these dances was only 5 minutes, and I really worked it, and I relearned it, and I remembered, and I did everything. But these dancers weren't capable of dancing it. I just say, brisé-volé with a little curve over, everything became the same. What was good about the work, it was also about we as a company, we were football players, so we had Celtic shirts and Rangers shirts, so there was another political aspect, especially to do that in Glasgow. It was big orange walk and all that, all these people. But now what I've learned from it, so I want to create for Laban, hopefully next year, a Curious Orange suite. You know, 3 dances, 15 minutes, and I want to sort of create an adaptation that these people can dance it here and now, and get somebody from the conservatory to get a band together, and sort of I think it's very interesting to restage, redo. Otherwise, it just, you know, as I say, that archive is non-existent. Nobody can see it anymore. Everybody says, "Oh, that was so fantastic. I remember." And I think it's good for these young people to do it. And now, so I'm excited about that.
Saying that, you've just reminded me of, you mentioned earlier about Merce Cunningham and how he had developed his archive, you know, well in advance, I guess. And, you know, I was thinking while you were saying that also about Yvonne Rayner and her work with Trio A, where, you know, she has designated individuals who, you know, have learned very specifically from her the movements that they are then allowed to pass on. Yeah, I wondered if you could speak a bit more about that, because from what you described of Merce, it sounded like they could be quite adaptable, and like you're talking about doing with Curious Orange, that the works can be a bit more fluid and malleable. Whereas I felt with Yvonne Rayner, you know, I remember speaking to someone who was trained to pass on Trio A, that she was very, very precise in terms of how each movement should be done, and you know, kind of wanted to maintain very strict control, I guess, on that. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about this.
learned Trio A from Yvonne. And she is really rigorous. And it's also very interesting because in the end, you must look kind of as if you're not performing again. You know, it's really sort of nothing, you know, no performance, no projection, no this, just looking at it. It's very hard. But what I think is interesting is even when these transmitters are so rigorous, I think it's really good for a newer generation and a newer generation to embody that, to having to go through that rigor, because they will create something out of it, a different work. They have an experience of it, and I think to experience it is sort of a really good learning curve. You can trash it afterwards. You know, you can do something completely different. You can just whatever, you know. So I think that's really important, I think, for as what transmissions are, and also like say Adis Marina Abramovich, just the rigor of it. And for Merce Cunningham, what is so interesting is he has this foundation, and during the year, every year, there are about 5 or 6 performances all over the world of his work, also taught by his transmitters, who really embodied it. But there is sort of so much in that philosophy of Merce, is like, you know, you dance it slightly different than so-and-so, because you are you, and you do that, and you do that. So each time the piece stays new from now, with bodies from now, probably very different than 1950s bodies, very different than Merce's body. And I think that's very clever. Instead of, you know, we want to stick to this, and actually it's not. It's just a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and then it's dead, museum stuff. So I think that's a good way of having an archive that is used in this time. The other archive I know that's really is the most visited archive in New York in the library is John Cage. Isn't that interesting? Sort of, they all go there and sort of create work out of it, or thinking, or conceptual art, or it's kind of interesting. So I think that's very generous to put an archive like that for other people.
I think one thing I find fascinating in terms of dance performances is that at times you will find that works that have had a long life and been formed over and over again, and then there are certain people then passing on these, say, after the creator is dead, and at times they have learnt it. So you have people who've learned to work in the 50s and people who've learnt the work in the 80s, and it will come out with very different elements to it that relate both to those times and obviously to people now. And I think you can't, I mean, yes, there are certain performances that are going to be as much carbon copied as feasibly possible, knowing that you have 2 different people and therefore cannot be identical. But there is also this sort of sense of wealth, of at times, you know, performers change because where they are, what space they're in, who they're working with, who the audience is, and all those sort of things. And so I think actually one's always got to acknowledge that when things are passed on, they have to live. That's very important. And that they have changed over time is inevitable. And that's actually part of the excitement of it. And particularly when you see different versions that have come from different routes. And then you think, gosh, it's all one work, but it's even richer because of that interpretation.
When you were saying this as well, I was curious because what Ellen was talking about and kind of, I suppose, the work the V&A does, I was curious to hear how you also deal with this live element, I guess, within, you know, you talked about the living exhibition that had been realized of one of your archives. I mean, is the archive, is there any kind of live elements ever considered as part of it or enacted by it in some way?
I think it's actually an area that's going to be developed. I really think it's something people are looking forward to. It's not just objects in boxes and things like that. I think there is a real sense that material is there for people to use, to discover. I think it's very, very difficult for us to actually sort of think about live performance in parts of the museum, but then in other parts of the museum, there's so much happening. I think, museums aren't the dry, dusty places they once were. That's why, all of you have been performing in them. It's much more exciting because of that. And it's the same, you rearrange a museum, an art gallery, and you look at it afresh. Somebody comes in and does a performance in that space, and it's a new space. Everything there is different, and that's wonderful.
So I was just thinking when you were talking about this as well, and someone had mentioned earlier about the elements that do exist in National Archives. For example, I'm not sure if someone had mentioned earlier Tate's archive. You had, Lois, mentioned that you saw what you had as a collection, and then suddenly it's being repurposed as an archive. And I feel there was that Tate exhibition, I think, was it called Painting After Performance or something? Yeah, where I suppose it was a reassessment of a lot of the objects and artifacts in the Tate archive, which they realize actually these are, essentially the ephemera that surrounds performance, and kind of looking at it in a different way. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that in terms of the collection of, books or ephemera that you have. But equally, I'm also interested to hear from the artists too about, for work, I suppose, you had the show at Studio Voltaire, or, if your work was going into a museum or institutional context, what would you see being included, or, how would that translation occur, I wonder?
I just want to grab the microphone because I'm slightly panicking about the time. What is the time? 8:45. Oh, I have got to get a train in a minute. So I've got to do a performance tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Some guerrilla toilet cleaning in Hailsham. Not to be missed. I'll put the leaflets out in a minute. Anyway, what were we talking about?
What would go in the archive? It's your subject.
Well, people have talked about how the archive becomes a different thing. And, the archive isn't the performance. The archive is kind of whatever is left, really. And sometimes there's photographs and sometimes there aren't. And then sometimes there's memories. Sometimes, there's lots of facts. Sometimes there's hardly anything. And in a way, the thing I've enjoyed about doing our archive is the kind of forensic angle. It's like, just these tiny, weeny little things. Then suddenly things click into place. It's a bit like being a detective. And it's, in a way, that's the opposite to the sort of things people are talking about, like the memory in the body, but it's the thing I found the most satisfying, really. And then you suddenly meet someone that saw the performance, and then they give you a little story, or there's just a date, and you think, oh, I know what that photograph is, and it's really exciting. So. Can
I just say as well, also in the archive, things like maybe a pair of flip-flops that we wore that night, or a feather boa. So it's very much things as well as documentation.
Yeah, I think like ephemeras, it depends on the performance. Like I mentioned earlier, Evan and I are creating a script for this, so it's logical that script would be the element that goes into the performance, and there's a lot of potential in like a script for a performance. But it would depend on the performance completely.
Post-it notes. There's a lot of post-it notes. I actually have started an archive. I think just because of like how long and deeply I've been thinking about them. Like pretty early on in my practice, I started to just hold on to like any flyers, anything from things that I do. But yeah, I'm also somebody who writes a lot. So there'd probably be a lot of that. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Lots of post-it notes.
I was just gonna add on that for example, Evan and I are going to visit the papers of Octavia E. Butler at the Huntington in LA, and this a kind of archive. It has like notes, various kind of like writings that she did for herself, kind of notebooks, lots of different like writing around the writing, and like I think that's really exciting to see what happens around the performance, because that can often give a better idea than a video of at like an odd angle of a performance.
I spent, I think, 5 years on Michael Clark's archive, as you know as well. And I would sort of really rigorously remember, so I got it from the beginning, from his little performances in Aberdeen, his first ballet school, and his Highlands dancing reports, always fantastic. So it starts really very young, and for the office it was always the Michael Clark Company archive, and I say no, it's Michael Clark archive, which is the artist, and I think that's a really different. That's big. So I worked and I slogged on, and I like a detective found the whole line. They had forgotten it completely. And then I got it so far that the Tate was really interested, wanting it. And he said, but Ellen, we also want Michael's personal archive. And I know that Michael has his own beautiful archive, which is his. But of course, there's no way he's going to hand that over. And I think that's also really important. And I said to them, I said, look, if you look at the work, you see the artist. You just work a little bit harder. But they want to have his letters, his notes, this and this and that, which for him is like really, really personal. So I thought that was really awkward, an awkward situation, because I would have loved that archive, you know? People would have come. They want to know about Lee Bowery, it's in there. They want to know about neo-naturists, Marky Smith, blah, 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 you know, all these sort of things. And I would find things and I would give it to Michael, because I know he wanted it. So it wouldn't go into that whole thing. And then it's gone. You know, he has a heart. He has a heart too. I think it's very important. The artist has a say as well. You know, he's not dead, sort of.
Do you think, I don't know, I'm only just thinking about this, are we worrying about archives too much as artists? I mean, I'm not an archivy person. I would never have thought of doing an archive. I just do it, and nearly always, like I said in the slideshow, I forget about taking photographs. But the idea of, why should Michael hand over stuff while he's living? You know, when he's dead, isn't that the time that it should go to the Tate Gallery? Mm-hmm. Or he can leave it to where he wants it to go, I guess.
You know, as an artist, his work is archived, and that is, if that is for Michael, that is enough. It is enough. You know.
Yeah, no, I'd be worried that artists aren't worried enough about archives. Because unless you kind of really trust that, I mean, just, you know what Christine said, that as soon as all the people you were working with started getting famous and writing books, suddenly neo-naturists was completely misrepresented. So I think it's, you know, it's whose version of events, as Christine said, whose version of events are we sort of looking at? I think it's a bit like with Michael Clark's archive as well. You can look at it from a sort of dance history, you can look at it from an art history, you can also look at it from music history. You know, I Am Curious Orange was a turning point for me. It was a gateway for me in terms of popular culture, drugs, and everything else. None of that would appear in Tate's archive, I'm sure. The stories that could be told. So I don't think you should. I think you should be worrying more about archives, or at least entrust somebody to worry on your behalf about archives, because otherwise, history is going to be. You know, history is written by the victors. Remember that.
Thank you. On that note, I think we will wrap it up. I'm conscious. Yes, yeah. I am conscious that we said we'd leave space for audience questions, but I don't want to keep everyone here all night. So I will literally allow space for one audience question, and the first person who has their hand up. There. Oh, it's a bit of time. Please go ahead. Maybe I'll.
Yes, it's the opposite of live art, dead art. It's the opposite of live art, dead art.
That's probably a question for Lois of the Live Art Development Agency, no?
No, it's not.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Really, really appreciate you sticking out to the end. I hope you enjoyed it all. Oh, yes, and we're all carrying on to the Student Union bar afterwards if anyone would like to join.